Good morning, everyone. My name is Samantha Oliver, and I am one of the coaches for this semester. I had the chance to participate in X Culture as a student in fall of 2015 when I was at the University of Alabama. I also had the chance to participate at the fall 2016 symposium on the cruise. So I've had the chance to kind of go through the program where you guys are a little bit. And I just wanted to talk today about your final report. I know that your rough draft is due this weekend. And just go over a few, especially formatting things that I wish I had known when I was a student, and that I know a lot of people have had questions about. So let me switch over to my presentation and we can go through that. Let me see. Share my window. Okay. So again, just going through a few report guidelines here. First, want to go through the title page. We say don't judge a book by its cover, but obviously most of us do. And this is basically your book's cover. So this is the first impression that the client is going to get of your presentation. So a few do's. Make sure you keep it neat and professional. That includes spelling, any punctuation and grammar that might be on there. Just want to keep it streamlined and make it look nice. Definitely, we suggest using pictures. A lot of teams tend to use the company logo. If you can, get in contact with the client, try and get their official logo, any of that. And finally, on your title page, you want to make sure you include all of this information. So the team number, the client name, member names, member emails, countries of residence, as well as each of your team member duties. So if you don't use bad pictures. So while we suggest using pictures, you want to make sure that they're high resolutions. Make sure they're not blurry, especially if it's going to be the client logo. And definitely don't forget to put what each member of your team did. This is important not only for X Culture for us to kind of see how all the dynamics of the team worked, but they're definitely important for your professors as well to know what all was completed on there. So just want to go through a few examples of some good ones and some not so good ones. This one, the logo for starters is a little blurry. It's obviously readable, but you can see it's fuzzy. And then down here, the team didn't really put any of their information that they needed on there. So, no emails and definitely not what anyone did. This is an example of one that I really liked. They have a kind of unique logo. They found a unique logo for the company, and they also did a good job of giving a very basic description of what every team member did. And then finally, this one kind of goes in the middle. So they have some issues because they didn't really highlight the client company's name, but they did do a really good job, I thought, of describing what each person did. Went into a little bit more detail than the last example. And they also included a pretty nice picture of the client's product. So overall, this one had some flaws, but definitely looked better than the first one. So next is the table of contents. This is a section that's not technically required, but we definitely encourage it. Helps to keep your paper as a whole organized, and it will help us as well as the clients find a specific section if we're interested later. Not required. I just kind of combined everything onto one slide, short slide here. So some do's, make sure you line everything up, especially the numbers. A couple tips for that is if you are having some trouble, you can always turn on the grid lines in Word. I believe you just go under the view settings and then click the check mark for grid lines. That can help you see how everything is lined up. Another way to do it is there is a built-in table of contents builder in Word. Sometimes it can get a little glitchy just because it is a template. but that can also help you keep everything lined up. Try to keep it on one page. There's really no reason that a table of contents needs to go onto 2 pages. If you absolutely have to, you can, but make sure that you put it on its own page. So don't combine it with your executive summary. Don't put it at the bottom of that page. Don't put it at the top of the section 1 page, any of that. So you want to just make sure it has its own page. And finally, check that that everything matches at the end of your report. A lot of times teams will set up their table of contents first, and then page numbers end up changing, so they don't end up matching between the table of contents and the actual page numbers. So just go back through at the end before your final submission and make sure that everything matches up. If you don't, actually, I think there's only one, don't ignore the section names. So if your section block is about market analysis, make sure you title it market analysis. Don't title it as section 1, section 2. That doesn't give us any information. It doesn't give the client any information about what's in that section. So if we're reading your executive summary and we're really interested in your pricing suggestions, and you have it labeled as section 8, it's going to be harder for us to go through and find that information. So just make sure you try and title it with the section names. So another few examples. This one looks pretty good. It has some good, it has all the correct section titles and all of that, but the numbers are a little skewed here. It's not a huge deal, but it ends up looking a little unprofessional. So you just want to, if anything, justify your numbers. This one was definitely a little long, but I think that they did a good job of basically titling all of their sections and numbering them so you know exactly where every piece of information is. And finally, this also was a good one in terms of titling the sections, but as you can see, they're all blue and hyperlinked, which is a really positive thing. It's really great if you know that everyone's going to be reading this online. If for some reason someone decided to print out the report, obviously this doesn't help a whole lot. It doesn't have the page numbers. So it's great that you can click on there and it will take you straight to that section, but it's only nice if you're reading it online. So your next section is your executive summary. And as a note, sometimes people will put the executive summary before the table of contents. That's really up to you guys on how you want to structure that. There's no set way on there. But do know that your executive summary might be something that might be all that someone reads. The CEOs are going to be getting 50 to 150 reports, and they don't necessarily have time to read your executive summary or read anything other than your executive summary, I'm sorry. So you want to make sure that your executive summary really touches on all the high points of your full report. Someone should be able to read the summary and get a solid idea of what it is you're discussing in your report. So some do's for this. Do use bullet points. It really helps to keep everything concise and streamlined. It also helps to pick out all of the information that's needed. As a minor suggestion, I would suggest either choosing to do all full sentences or all partial phrases. That way you just keep it similar and in line with each other. If you do choose to just do short phrases, you don't need to necessarily use periods on that. If you do sentences, I would suggest using proper punctuation. But again, that's going to kind of be a team-based decision. And make sure you make it easy to find your information. So even if you aren't using bullet points, just make sure you either bold or italicize or even highlight the important parts of your information. we don't want to, and your client's not going to want to have to kind of hunt through a big block of text for what it is you're trying to say. So bullet points are usually the ideal option, but if for some reason you don't want to use bullet points, just make sure it's easy to pick out all of your important information. So some don'ts for the executive summary. Don't put it at the end. I've seen several teams who have done this in the past, and it really somewhat defeats the purpose of the executive summary. The summary is to give someone an idea of whether or not they really want to continue reading the rest of your report. So if you put it at the end, it really doesn't help anyone. Don't write a novel or appear unfocused. So I mean, here is, again, like I mentioned, you don't want to just write a whole big block of text. That's not, again, it's not going to be helpful for the client especially. It just requires a lot of reading time that they might not necessarily have. So you want to make it easy for them to pick out the main points so that they can determine whether or not they want to move forward with your report. And finally, try not to go over one page. There's technically no requirement on this. You can take up as many pages as you want, but typically shorter tends to be better. So try to keep it concise. Sometimes there can be a mental block against flipping that page over. It might make it seem longer and more complicated than it really is. So if you can, just try to keep it on one page. I know that's sometimes difficult, especially when you're trying to figure out what information should go in your executive summary and all that. If you have any questions about that, you can always reach out to the coaches, and we're more than welcome to give you, or more than happy to give you feedback. But we just suggest to try and keep it on a page. So for review examples, this one was pretty good. I like that it's really easy to find their information. I would say that the information along the bullet points might be a little long for my taste, but it's easy to scan it and see where their main points are. This one, on the other hand, yeah, all of it. It's pretty easy at the beginning to pick out the name Kenya as their potential market, but scanning through, that's pretty much all you can really strongly pick out of their ideas. So you just want to be careful with just providing this big block of text like this. On the flip side, this one is almost a little too short. So we say keep it short and concise, but you want to make sure that you touch on all your points. And this one really only discussed what market they were interested in going into. Past that, it really didn't provide much of any information of what's going to be in the rest of their report. So you want to find that happy medium of keeping it short, but also making sure you cover all of your points. And finally, this one, again, is somewhat in the middle. So we have some issues up here going from double space to single space. You want to try and keep that consistent. I also think it's a little busy, but I do like and appreciate how they broke down each of their sections. I think there may be a few too many bullet points. Obviously, they go on to 2 pages. So it's decent, not perfect, but it at least covers all of the points it needs to cover. So next is the figures and tables. You know, picture's worth 1,000 words, so we really enjoy seeing these figures and tables, but there's a lot of do's and don'ts for these as well. Make sure you do use them. Like I said, you know, picture's worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it can portray a lot more information than just you writing it out. So don't be afraid of using them. Like your title page, make them neat, professional, and readable. It's unfortunately not very helpful to anyone if you can't read the figure or the table. So make sure that they're clean and well put together and all of that. No blurry pictures if you're copying, pasting. If you're doing it yourself, just make sure that the design looks clean and it can be easily read. And finally, make sure that they're useful. Pictures can take up a lot of space, especially in Word, in terms of its formatting. I know that sometimes when you put a table into Word and it's surrounded by text, the text can get all skewed and everything. These things do take up space out of your report. You have a limited number of pages. So don't just put something in just because you want a picture. Make sure it serves some form of purpose. So some don'ts for the figures and tables. Don't always copy and paste. Just because it looks good on the internet doesn't mean it's necessarily going to look good in your report. A lot of times they'll come out blurry or hard to read. Sometimes you have to zoom way out in order to capture all the information, and then you can't read the graph. So oftentimes for a table or for a chart or graph or any sort of thing like that, you're usually better off to try and recreate them yourself if possible. I realize that's not always, possible for you. So if not, just do your best in finding a clearer picture. Don't lose your spacing. Like I mentioned before, sometimes when you copy and paste something into Word or insert it into Word, it can cause problems with the spacing. So just be careful with this. Make sure you check before you turn in your final submission. I've seen several cases where somehow a figure or table has ended up in the middle of a sentence. Try to avoid that. Just make sure that you're keeping all of your spacing around the picture or table. And along with that, finally, don't cover up your text. A lot of times there might be a white background that you don't know is necessarily there on a picture. You copy and paste it, and all of a sudden half your sentence is gone. So just check for that again. These are just things to check and look through on your final edits. So a few examples. This one, it looks like a nice graph, but you really kind of have to squint to read what's written in the yellow. So I think that I'm not sure if the team copied and pasted this or if they did it themselves. If they did do it themselves, then they should have checked that yellow color beforehand. If they copied and pasted it, I would have told them to probably try and recreate it themselves. This one seems to be on market entry strategies, and it really, obviously they copied and pasted it. It's pretty fuzzy, and I think it could have benefited, especially from horizontal lines, breaking up each of the rows. It seems to go a little overboard with information. So just be careful with stuff like this. This is kind of a trap. It might look nice, again, on the website, but then you copy and paste it and it doesn't always necessarily translate well. So just be careful with things like this. If you want to include something like this, I personally would suggest putting it in an appendix, and we'll talk about appendices here in a moment. But I'm not sure this necessarily needs to be in the body of your report. This one as well, the picture is fairly blurry. Obviously, they discuss it somewhere at some point in the report, as I mentioned graphic 4, but this isn't really a picture that you could look at and immediately understand what's going on. I realize for people in Europe, it's probably easier to understand. But for those of us outside of Europe, it might be a little bit harder to kind of catch what it's trying to show. So just be careful with that. Make sure that, someone could look at your figure or graph and understand what it is you're trying to say without needing to fully explain it necessarily. This one is a figure that it looks like the team made themselves. I think it looks really good. They did a nice job of expanding the labels so that they weren't necessarily all on top of the graph. It just makes it easier to read. It makes it a little bit cleaner, nice colors, everything showed up well. So that's a nice example of that. This one, it's a nice chart. One problem is it seems like it cut off some of the sentence, which is a little bit of a concern. I might be wrong there, so there's that possibility. It's also not necessarily incorrect, but I think it would have been better if their chart had had everything labeled rather than only 3 of the blocks labeled. That, again, is just more of a personal preference, but I think it would look cleaner and a lot more professional had they labeled everything there. This one is a team SWOT chart, and this is a chart that pretty much everyone always includes as a built chart, and it's something that can either really help your report or really hurt your report, depending on how you set it up. So this team, I really like how they did it. They have everything broken down into bullet points, but they're descriptive enough that you understand what they're trying to say. It's nicely colored. Everything's broken up well. So that's something I would suggest spending some time on, is your SWOT chart. If you're asked to include a SWOT chart, that's something that a lot of companies look for, and it can be really important for that client. So you just want to make sure that it looks as clean and as professional as possible. This is an example of when not to just include a picture for the sake of including a picture. So they have this picture here showing a survey. This is obviously just a stock photo that they pulled off of Google, or pulled off the internet somewhere. And it really doesn't bring a whole lot to their report. So again, it takes up space, not necessarily a whole lot. And if I remember correctly, this team wasn't necessarily pressed for space, but it does take up space and it's not really needed. As opposed to this one, which it shows a picture of a consumer using the product. It's a nice, clear picture. It's a cute picture. It just shows a little bit more of a human side to the client, and it brings something else to the report. It brings an example of the product to the report. So just make sure if you're going to include a picture like this, that it is useful to your report and to your analysis. So for the appendices, again, these are not required, but definitely encouraged. Some teams use them, some teams don't. That's going to be up to you and how you set up the rest of your report. Some do's and don'ts. Do make sure you keep everything organized. Make sure you reference it in the text. If you're going to go out of your way to include it in your report somewhere, make sure that you reference it somewhere else within the text. Don't just tack on an extra appendix because you want to. Make sure it has a use somewhere. And make sure you break everything up. Have multiple appendices. So if you have 6 tables, make those 6 separate appendices if you need to. There's no reason why you necessarily have to combine everything. And that goes with point number 1 of just keeping everything organized. As a don't go crazy. Don't lose control with it. You don't need to have 15 appendices. I know I just said that you want to break everything up, but you also don't want to tack on too many extra pages to this. And don't be afraid to use if you need to. I think a lot of teams maybe get nervous about using an appendix for whatever reason, and they'll put, page-long graphs or tables that take up page and a half. And really, that's something that could probably go in the appendix. Otherwise, it's just, again, taking up space in your report and pages in your report. So that's going to be up to you. It's going to be really a team-based decision. But I personally don't mind appendices. I think they're nice in certain contexts. Just make sure you don't go crazy with them. And finally, your formatting. So how it all comes together. I know a lot of teams have had some questions on this, so I want to make sure we go over it. All of this information also can be found at the end of your client information packet. So if you have more questions, you can go look it up there. So this is kind of how it all comes together at the end. So some do's, do include page numbers. Minimalist is better. It's really all you basically need for a header and footer are the page numbers. And again, going back to the table of contents, just make sure everything matches up before your final submission. Do include your section summaries. I know we're asking for that this semester. So you want to make sure you include your key recommendations and numbers. It doesn't need to be more than 2 to 4 bullet points. It's almost like mini executive summaries for each section. So you just want to give the client a good idea of what's going to be in that section. So if they want to get more details, they can continue reading, or they can just read that section summary. Do you use Times New Roman, size 12 font? Obviously, we're not going to straight up measure your font size, but this is our suggested font type and size. Indent the start of each paragraph. It helps us. It helps the client see where maybe a new idea is starting. And finally, use APA citations. This is something that a lot of teams seem to struggle with. So if you have questions, you are more than welcome again to reach out to a coach. We've been trained on this. We can help you. Alternatively, you can always Google it. A side note for APA citations, Google does not count necessarily as a citation. Google Images is not a reference either. I was always taught that Wikipedia is not a reference either, but that might depend on your school. So just be careful with what it is you're referencing exactly. And some don'ts for formatting. Don't go crazy. Concise, keep it concise. It's better. Don't leave information out. So this is a big one. Go through the client instructions before your final submission. Make sure you have all of that information included. I've seen, I can't tell you how many reports where someone has left out an entire section. And I don't know if they forgot to put it in. I don't know if they just didn't do it. Either way, it usually doesn't end up looking very professional. This is something, that the client specifically asked for, and if you leave it out, you didn't necessarily complete the project up to their standards. So just make sure you go back through before your final submission and you check to make sure you have everything included. Don't mess with the margin sizes. Keep them at 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. Don't use single spacing. We suggest you double space. A lot of teams still do single space. I understand, especially if you're pressed on your length of paper, but double spacing just makes it a little bit easier to read when it's a big block of text. Don't reline your text, just keep it left aligned. And don't misspell words, please, especially the client name or product names or a country name, anything like that. Seen a couple reports where the client name was misspelled on the title page. And please don't do that. Just go back through, run spell check really quickly, check and make sure that everything's spelled correctly. And you should be good to go. So that is it for me. Let me pull this back up and stop screen sharing. So I don't think anyone has any questions. I don't think anyone's here right now. So on that note, if you have any questions after watching this, please feel free to reach out to a coach, admin@xculture.org, all of that. We're more than welcome to help. I'm more than happy to help. So wish you guys all the luck in the world and I hope things go well for you. Have a good one.